In this roundup of the week, the European Union launches its climate law, criticised by some for going too far, criticised by Greta for being too weak. Is it actually the EU's opening gambit to put pressure on China and India and maybe even President Trump to play ball on climate? Extinction Rebellion suffers major discomfort as its founder Roger Hallam proves uncontrollable by them, but not by the US government. And does the industrial shutdown caused by the coronavirus signal the short-term extinction of the human race? My name is Mallen Baker. This is the Mallen Baker Show for Changemakers. I'm back from Argentina. Flew in this morning on a flight having gotten no sleep whatsoever. So if I start to nod off in this video, just make some comments in all caps in the comment section. Should wake me up. Thanks for all the positive responses to my experimental unscripted Q&A session while I was in Buenos Aires. Sounds like something I might try more of. Probably not just focused on replying to comments. But if I do that, it will be as well as not instead of the standard videos. Heard that loud and clear. Right, let's jump straight in. The European Union has launched its climate law, which targets net zero carbon by 2050. EU President Ursula von der Leyen said, "We are acting today to make the EU the world's first climate neutral continent by 2050. The climate law is the legal translation of our political commitment and sets us irreversibly on the path to a more sustainable future." This was the first big announcement by the newly appointed Commission. They wanted it to make a splash, even invited Greta Thunberg to come to the launch to endorse it. Well, that didn't work out too great, but we'll come to that in a moment. Although it's called a law, it's a bit more complicated than that because the EU can't just announce new laws that all of its members have to enforce. It isn't the government of the EU. What happens next, according to the Financial Times, is that the 2050 target will take the form of an EU regulation that the states will have to put into their own legislation in a form that suits them, but while also meeting the requirements of the EU regulation. With some of the countries less happy about the target than others, it's currently an open question what degree of enforcement sanctions the EU would be able to bring to bear against any countries that decided not to play along. Generally, the EU would have to launch infringement proceedings against countries that don't meet its regulations, which can be a drawn-out process with warnings and more warnings and final warnings and maybe even final warnings. And if it was going to react to countries failing to meet the 2050 deadline for net zero, it would be ending up left taking action only as the deadline approaches and it becomes obvious that not enough has been done, by which time it's already too late. So to get around that, the EU is working on some interim targets for earlier deadlines like 2030. But a number of countries are expected to resist such measures because of the likely extra short-term costs that they would involve. For instance, the Environment Minister for Flanders, Zuhal Demir, suggested that if European commissioners wanted to change the Flemish climate targets for 2030, then they should stand for election in Flanders. The pressure is on to get an agreement before the COP26 summit later this year, in the hope that the EU can be showing a united front. Agreement would make it the first continent worldwide to embrace such a target. In addition, the EU is now starting to work on its carbon border adjustment tax. And this is where you'll start to get some global ripples coming out from this. The tax basically shields EU companies from imports from countries with weaker carbon commitments. One of the intended benefits of this would be to stop so-called carbon leakage, where high climate standards in one country simply pushes polluters to produce elsewhere to meet the same demand, hence creating just as much pollution whilst also making local industries less competitive. And of course, the really interesting part is the impact this might ultimately have on those who are seen as the climate laggards. It's a distant prospect at the start, but the FT recently reported speculation that the EU could join forces with like-minded blocs of nations to create climate clubs big enough to use leverage on the rest to speed up emissions cuts. Now, if we end up with a US led by Joe Biden or Bernie Sanders next year, that group might well include the US. If we don't, maybe the US would be one of the targets. I, for one, would be fascinated to see how that played out in the standard diplomacy channel, otherwise known as President Trump's Twitter account. The US has already threatened in a more conventional way that it would react to an EU carbon tax in a way that it would to any other protectionist measures. But I've flagged before that this is clearly where some of the action is going to go. China and India have every incentive to play the longer game when it comes to the climate negotiations, because, as any good marketer knows, when the other side in a negotiation is feeling the time pressure, and when you can happily walk away from the table, when they've already given away the fact that they don't feel that they can, that's when you have the maximum leverage to get the best deal. China knows that. India knows that. Now, Europe and other nations that are influenced by the frame that says we have to all come together as fast as possible, they're either going to be put in a position where they have to strike an incredibly generous deal to China and India to incentivize them to up the ambition. And it was already the one-sidedness of the Paris Agreement in that regard that President Trump noted in pulling out of Paris. And, this is one of those difficult truths. From that deal-making perspective, it wasn't an irrational thing to do. Or else Europe and the others have to find ways to give themselves more leverage to push progress from the others on slightly more equal terms. And they have a big incentive to do that because they're already paying a lot of money. Europe is not a country, it's a club of very different countries, some of which have been heavily dependent on coal and therefore need a lot of financial support if they're going to transition as fast as Europe wants to go. So they need to maximise the value of what they have that China might want. And that comes down to trade, because they can't afford to do a deal where they just give China and India a bunch of cash in order to line up. None of this realpolitik was spelled out in the actual climate law. And none of what was spelled out in the climate law satisfied Greta Thunberg and her young army of campaigners. She dismissed the target for 2050 as unambitious and called it a betrayal. She said the law was empty words and accused the EU of pretending to be a leader on climate change. You'd think that they would have noticed by now that Greta doesn't really follow the script when they are looking for her to endorse them. You've got to think that at some point the adults are going to stop inviting her to come along just so that she can beat them on the head. Because it's hard now to see what the incentive is to keep amplifying the youth campaign voices. The campaigners are doing what campaigners will often do when faced with a complex problem. They will isolate and obsess on just one variable in the equation. They don't have to implement the change. So the fact that it's impossible to create the change by focusing only on that one variable, that's something they can ignore. And I don't blame them for that. I did the same in my own youth when we marched against nuclear weapons. Every argument we made about why nuclear weapons should never ever be used were totally correct. But by only seeing the situation in those terms, you missed out a lot of important context that wouldn't just go away because you wished it would. So yes, utterly understandable that the black and white mindset from the young people's campaign's point of view. But the nations have to work out how to make it actually work. And it's now becoming head-scratchingly bizarre that they keep deciding to bring in Greta Thunberg to dominate the headlines by telling them how little they're actually doing, when they're actually doing so far more in this area than anyone has attempted before. They're almost certainly going to make mistakes as they go, because governments generally will do when they try to go both fast and far. You have to be able to go at the pace that enables you to avoid those mistakes where possible and self-correct where not. This is one of the basics of creating successful, long-lasting change, which is just so much harder to do than people think. And it's not as though the campaigners are demonstrating with their own actions how easy it is to solve these difficult dilemmas. Indeed, looking at Extinction Rebellion's increasingly torturous attempts to deal with its internal tensions this week, they seem to be able to move slowly and yet still make mistakes. That seems to be the case anyway, as there has been barely contained warfare going on over the activities of XR founder Roger Hallam. Just to recap, Roger Hallam, co-founder of the group and the original author of the initial strategy, which was to recruit large numbers of people to undertake mass civil disobedience. The numbers of arrests were intended to overwhelm the state's resources. And once the movement reached a magical 3.5% of the population, the state would fall and be replaced in the short term by a citizens' assembly. That was then. A lot of water's passed under the bridge since, not least that Roger's radicalism has become rather controversial within the group, not just outside of it. He pushed the edge with BBC appearances, claiming that the science said that 6 billion people would die in the coming decades because of climate change, which then other XR speakers were challenged to defend on television, which they obviously couldn't because the science doesn't say that at all. Then he really put the cat amongst the pigeons with what he admitted was a deliberately provocative interview in the German media where some felt that he downplayed the Holocaust, because that always ends well. He was disavowed by a number of XR groups, and the organisation struggled to cope, launching a convoluted and apparently helpless internal reconciliation process. This week it came out that the group had specifically tried to stand Hallam down. A letter dated at the end of January said this: "With much love, we request that you step back for 3 months as a spokesperson for Extinction Rebellion in the media and at events." And this included everything. Don't accept speaking events if you might be taken as speaking for XR, and then adding the kicker that at the moment, if you speak anywhere, we need you to understand that even if you say you're not speaking as a representative of XR, what you say will be associated with XR, which is true. If you look at the language of that letter, you can see it's people trying their best to rein in someone they feel is totally out of control. This is not a happy, consensual discussion. This is them trying to put down someone who will not do as they are told. And that becomes obvious when, having started the letter with much love, they move on to threatening him. If during this period another situation happens, we will communicate to the movement and media that Roger is no longer a spokesperson for XR and does not speak for the movement. Anything he has said is not representative of XR. For that reason, we will not be commenting further. So that was a month ago. We found out about it because Extinction Rebellion added an update to its website on the 1st of March. It described its process of various internal meetings which had failed to reach a conclusion. It said that it had asked Roger to step back, provided a link to the letter that we just looked at. It said that he'd agreed to step back, but then noted he was about to undertake a tour of the United States. Roger Hallam is due to go to the US in March, travelling in a personal capacity to promote his book. Now, this is Roger's book promoting Extinction Rebellion. It's hard to argue that it's a personal capacity to promote a book that's promoting the movement. We also understand that Roger will be seeing a number of potential funders for Extinction Rebellion. Do you hear how out of control this is? This trip has not been funded by or agreed with Extinction Rebellion UK. Roger is not a spokesperson in person or in the media for Extinction Rebellion. An open Zoom call has been held for rebels in the US in order to discuss and answer questions about the trip. So they're going out their way to say, nothing to do with us, and even having a direct call with their counterparts in the US to make sure that they're brought up to speed with how out of control this situation really is. Well, it may be that Extinction Rebellion has no control over Roger Hallam's actions, but the United States government, it turns out, has no such problems. It simply refused to grant Hallam a visa, and he was unable to go to the US at all. Immediate danger of a rampaging Roger Hallam making his way across the US, generating headlines, maybe building personal support and leverage with XR's funders, averted. But that's the interesting question for me. Why did he want to see some of XR's potential funders? Now, I've said before, if you follow the logic of the extreme doomerism that certain XR people, including Roger Hallam, promote, then you eventually end up justifying a move towards more radical actions. XR is pulling back from even the radicalism that Roger Hallam started them with. It's taking steps to shut him out of his own movement. Doesn't it seem likely that if a more radical splinter group is going to emerge, that the ground is set for Hallam himself to reach a split? I mean, wouldn't he say, what else? What other choice have I got? Might he not have come to the conclusion that this mass movement thing can't work, because as soon as you bring other people in, they dilute the focus? Now, I said from the start, that would happen because the founders had a left-wing agenda to bring about the downfall of the state, but they were recruiting people who didn't buy into that. They just wanted to do something about climate change. Barred from the US, Hallam ended up joining several US events via video link, which by all accounts were well attended, so he clearly has some support there. Apparently, in speaking to Troy NY activists, he called for the global economy to be shut down to prevent climate cataclysm. Shutting down the global economy sounds like something that could be a rallying cry for a tight-knit group of severe disruptors. Anyway, we'll just have to wait and see how all of this goes. According to some people, we won't have to wait very long because the end of our species is soon to overtake us. One of the remarkable unforeseen consequences of the current crisis with the coronavirus has been the visible clearing of major sources of pollution as industry in China has significantly and rapidly ground to a halt. We'll see consequences of this in all sorts of ways, not least a likely global economic recession, given how many business supply chains depend on China right now. Some of the campaigners have been pointing to maps showing the clearing of the pollution and sort of celebrating, saying things like, see, rapid action is possible and it works. If Roger wants to promote the shutdown of the global economy, he can point to those maps which show emissions and fortunately do not show human suffering. Because yes, rapid action is possible if you shut down all of the systems of wealth creation and you don't mind that suddenly many millions of people will be thrown into desperate poverty and death rates will skyrocket as a result, which may not be the good example you want to be highlighting as your desired end goal. But according to Dr. Guy McPherson, Professor Emeritus of the University of Arizona, these coronavirus-generated changes are the trigger for the long-promised near-term extinction of the human race. Yep. This is it, guys. Take a good look round, because here we go for the final push. McPherson posted a video blog recently saying that the huge drop in China adds up to around 24% of the world's industrial activity. With the sudden change this represents in aerosol concentrations in the atmosphere, he predicts that within days or a couple of weeks, there'll be a massive 1 degree rise in global temperature. And this ends badly for us. Here's Guy McPherson laying it out.
So an additional 1 degree C in a matter of weeks would be absolutely catastrophic. It's difficult for me to imagine very many species surviving that abrupt rise in temperature for very long, and most notably Homo sapiens, our own species, and our ability to survive that global average temperature rise. If those numbers are correct, then I would say by November 1st, plus or minus a few months, we will be out of habitat for our species, for Homo sapiens.
So, November the 1st, eh? Damn! So much for 12 years to save the planet. Now, many of you will know that just because Guy McPherson gives this message doesn't mean it's necessarily quite time to kiss your loved ones goodbye just yet. The man runs a website called Our Days Are Numbered, and he describes himself as the world's leading authority on abrupt climate change leading to near-term human extinction. That's one heck of a specialism. Now, you generally assume that if you get to be a leading authority on a subject, that would mean that you would know a lot of established facts about it, and you'd have, therefore, a good track record of demonstrating your knowledge and wisdom. Not so much. McPherson's first apocalyptic predictions came in 2008 when he said we would hit peak oil within 10 years, and this would mean food and water shortages and then the end of civilization as we know it. And several other deadlines for predicted catastrophe have also come and gone. And yet here we are again. Nobody seems to be joining in with this solo chorus of concern, since McPherson's arguments on global dimming, this suggested effect of reduced aerosols, has certainly been quoted by some of the Extinction Rebellion leaders amongst the litany of reasons why near-term catastrophe is bearing down on us. And of course, if McPherson was right that stopping all this industrial activity was going to lead to disaster, you'd have to point out that going to zero carbon emissions by 2025, the demand of Greta and Extinction Rebellion, and indeed shutting down the global economy as Roger Hallam wants, would kind of have the same effect. Anyway, this is why we should focus in on the mainstream science and the actual evidence rather than those focused on fevered speculation. And I mean literally fevered speculation in the current situation. Time for a few things that I like and things that I don't. One thing that I like, Greta Thunberg has hung over the last couple of weeks for different reasons. This is a brilliant video I saw this week with her cast as the Terminator. Now look, wherever you are on the phenomenon of Greta, love her, hate her, think she's fine but distracting to the real issues, if you can't enjoy the humour of this, you're taking it all too seriously. Here's a brief clip from that video.
How dare you!
One of the things that I don't like, unfortunately, also involves Greta Thunberg. Canadian oil company Exide Energy Services was at the centre of a huge row this week when employees distributed a decal that depicted a cartoon of a teenage climate campaigner being sexually assaulted. Now, this is the sort of thing that in a macho industry, some idiots might decide to do. There are always idiots. The test is how the company responds when something like that happens. And when the company's general manager, Doug Sparrow, was asked if he was aware that there were stickers circulating with his company's logo depicting the assault of Greta Thunberg, he reportedly said that, yes, he was aware. Then he was asked if he was okay with an image that suggested his company condones such an assault on children. There's only one right way to answer that question. I mean, you know, we know the answer because you only have to be remotely a decent human being to give that answer. But not Doug. No. His answer was to say, she is not a child. She is 17. Right. So celebrating non-consensual acts on young adult women, that's okay? That was quite possibly the most ignorant and stupid answer a business executive has ever given in that sort of situation. And, you know, because I've stated it here over and over, I'm not a fan of cancel culture and Twitter mobs calling for people to be fired because they make an off-colour joke that someone gets professionally offended by, and all of that. This is not one of those situations. Let's be clear. And of course, the company quickly realised that it was in deep trouble reputationally, issued an apology, suggesting the cartoon did not reflect the values of the company. We are taking action to condemn this image and its publication and are committed to recovering and destroying the decals we distributed. Exide's statement read, management accepts full responsibility and effective immediately has made organisational changes to reflect this. It's not immediately clear what that last bit means and whether Doug has borne the brunt of it. But I tell you this, I'm not buying it. The majority of companies that say they have values just print some statements on a poster, it goes on the chairman's wall, and nobody else in the company knows what the values are supposed to be. Those companies do not have values. Companies where you can phone up the lowest paid person in the company and they not only know the values, but they see them in action and how decisions are made day to day. So they know how they're meant to behave themselves. Those are companies that have values. Southwest Airlines is famously such a company. So no, I don't believe that this incident does not reflect the values of the company. If that was the case, Doug would never have given the response that he gave. It's an ugly look, and they need to deal with it with a lot more than just a lame apology and a bit of internal blaming and shaming. So there you are, one thing I like and one thing I don't. Both of them are about different ways of responding to the same phenomena. One is funny and creative, one is nasty and dehumanizing. You don't get to choose the outside environment you have to react to. It's always your choice how to react. And it always comes down to this. What sort of person do you want to be? Behave like that person. All right, there are other things, but we're well out of time. My name's Mallen Baker. This is The Mallen Baker Show.